There is a prison in the United States so secure, so isolated, and so psychologically punishing that even the people paid to work inside it admit they are afraid. This is not a prison where riots break out. This is not a prison where inmates shout through cell bars. This is not a prison where escape plans are whispered at night. This is a prison where silence is enforced, movement is controlled to the second, and human contact is almost completely erased. Welcome to ADX Florence, officially known as the United States Penitentiary Administrative Maximum Facility. To the outside world, it is called the most secure prison in America. To inmates, it is known by another name, the Alcatraz of the Rockies. But that nickname doesn't even begin to describe what happens behind these concrete walls. Because ADX Florence is not designed to rehabilitate. It is not designed to manage overcrowding. It is not designed to prepare inmates for release. It is designed to break them. Every man held here is considered too dangerous, too violent, or too uncontrollable for any other prison in the country. Terrorists, serial killers, gang leaders, spies, domestic extremists, men the U.S. government has decided must be completely removed from society, sometimes forever. Each inmate spends 23 hours a day alone in a concrete cell the size of a parking space. No cellmate, no group activities, no casual conversation. The bed is concrete. The desk is concrete. The walls are concrete. Even the window, a narrow slit of reinforced glass, is angled so prisoners cannot see the mountains, the sky, or the outside world. They are allowed out for exactly 1 hour per day, into a small, empty exercise pen often referred to by inmates as the dog run. And even then, they are alone. Meals are slid through a slot in the door. Medical care is delivered through thick barriers. Religious services are conducted through closed-circuit television. Some inmates go years without physically touching another human being. Psychologists have described ADX Florence as one of the most extreme forms of long-term isolation used anywhere in the modern world. Former inmates have reported hallucinations, memory loss, paranoia, suicidal thoughts, and yet, the most chilling statements don't come from the prisoners. They come from the guards. Correctional officers at ADX Florence are trained to expect total control, but many admit the environment affects them too. The silence, the constant surveillance, the knowledge that behind every door is someone labeled among the most dangerous humans alive. Guards describe working shifts where no one speaks for hours, where footsteps echo unnaturally, where the building itself feels hostile. Some officers have requested transfers after only months. Others refuse to discuss their experiences at all. Because ADX Florence is not just a prison, it is a psychological experiment conducted in real time. An experiment that asks a terrifying question. What happens to a human mind when it is denied meaningful human contact for years or decades? And perhaps an even darker one. How much control is too much control? This facility was built after the federal government concluded that some inmates could not be contained anywhere else, not even in maximum security prisons. Escapes had happened. Guards had been killed. Order had broken down. ADX Florence was the answer. Since opening in 1994, no inmate has ever escaped. Not one. But the cost of that absolute security is something rarely discussed. Behind these walls are men serving multiple life sentences. Inmates who know they will never walk free again. Men who wake up every morning knowing that today will be exactly like yesterday, and tomorrow will be no different. No seasons. No crowds, no conversations, just concrete, silence, and time. In this documentary, we are going inside ADX Florence to examine why this prison exists, who is sent here, and why, how daily life actually works inside a Supermax facility, what long-term isolation does to the human brain, and why critics say ADX Florence represents the most controversial punishment in the American justice system. This is not speculation. This is not fiction. This is reality, documented, recorded, and still happening today. Because somewhere in the mountains of Colorado, behind reinforced steel and concrete walls, the U.S. government operates a prison so controlled. Even the guards fear it. Before we begin, tap like, leave a comment, and subscribe to the channel. Your support helps us uncover the darkest corners of the prison system. Now let's step inside. Before ADX Florence ever existed, the United States prison system was already under strain, but not from overcrowding alone. It was struggling with something far more dangerous: control. By the late 1970s and 1980s, federal prisons across the country were facing a growing crisis. A small but extremely violent group of inmates who could not be contained by traditional maximum security facilities. These were not typical prisoners. They were men who organized murders from inside prison walls. Men who assaulted guards as a form of leverage. Men who used communication, intimidation, and influence to control entire prison units. Some were leaders of organized crime families. Some were domestic terrorists. Some were international extremists. Others were serial killers who viewed incarceration as another arena of dominance. The system had rules. These men did not follow them. The prison that broke the system. One event, more than any other, exposed just how unprepared the federal prison system truly was. In 1983, inside the United States Penitentiary in Marion, Illinois, then considered one of the most secure prisons in America, 2 correctional officers were murdered on the same day. The killings were deliberate, calculated. A message. The inmates responsible had already been identified as highly dangerous. Yet, even inside a maximum security environment, they were able to exploit moments of movement, communication, and routine. The response was unprecedented. The prison was placed on permanent lockdown. Inmates were confined to their cells for 23 hours a day, a practice that would later become the blueprint for a new kind of incarceration. That lockdown did restore control, but it also revealed something deeply unsettling. Extreme isolation worked. It reduced violence. It eliminated coordination. It removed the power structures inmates relied on. And that realization changed the future of American prisons forever. A radical idea takes shape. Federal prison officials began asking a question few wanted to voice publicly. What if the most dangerous inmates were never allowed to interact with anyone at all? Not occasionally. Not during lockdowns. But permanently. What if human contact itself became the variable that could be controlled? This idea was controversial even inside government circles. Psychologists warned about long-term mental damage. Civil rights groups warned about human rights violations. Legal experts warned about constitutional challenges. But prison administrators were focused on one thing only: absolute security. They wanted a facility where escapes would be impossible, communication would be minimal, and inmates would be so isolated they could never organize, intimidate, or influence anyone again. The result was a prison that would not simply hold inmates. It would neutralize them. Why Florence, Colorado? The location was not accidental. Florence, Colorado sits in a remote, sparsely populated region, surrounded by open land and rugged terrain. The isolation made outside interference unlikely and escape nearly impossible. The environment itself would work with the prison. Construction began in the early 1990s, with one guiding principle shaping every decision. Control must be total. Every hallway, every door, every window, every angle of every wall. Nothing was left to chance. The facility officially opened in 1994, and from the moment the first inmate arrived, it became clear that this was unlike anything the United States had ever built. A prison designed from fear. ADX Florence was not designed with rehabilitation in mind. There were no open yards, no communal dining halls, no shared work programs. Instead, the design focused on sensory deprivation and behavioral containment. Cells were built to minimize sound. Doors were reinforced steel, controlled electronically. Movement schedules were staggered so inmates would never encounter one another. Even the architecture was psychological. Windows were placed high and angled outward so inmates could not orient themselves to the outside world. This prevented tracking time by sunlight or seasons. The message was clear. You are here. You are alone. And you are not leaving. Who was this prison really for? The federal government never intended to fill ADX Florence with thousands of inmates. It was created for a very specific population. Men who had killed other inmates, murdered correctional officers, led criminal organizations from behind bars, carried out acts of terrorism, proven completely uncontrollable in other facilities. These inmates were not transferred lightly. Being sent to ADX Florence was considered the final step, the end of the line. Many inmates arrived knowing they would never be moved again. For them, ADX Florence wasn't just another prison. It was permanent exile. The silence becomes policy. Unlike earlier prisons, where isolation was used as punishment, ADX Florence made isolation the default condition. Silence wasn't a consequence. It was policy. Communication between inmates was intentionally limited to prevent the spread of influence or coordination. Guards were trained to interact minimally and professionally, without conversation. Even medical and mental health services were conducted through barriers whenever possible. This level of control had one goal: predictability. A predictable inmate is a controllable inmate. But predictability came at a cost. As years passed, reports began emerging of inmates experiencing severe psychological decline, even those with no prior mental health issues. Time blurred, reality fractured, identity eroded. And yet, from the government's perspective, the prison was doing exactly what it was built to do. Violence dropped to near zero. Escapes never happened. Organized crime influence collapsed. ADX Florence worked, at least on paper. The controversy begins. Almost immediately, critics began calling ADX Florence one of the harshest prisons on earth. Human rights organizations compared its conditions to psychological torture. Former inmates described the isolation as worse than physical pain. Mental health experts warned that prolonged solitary confinement could permanently damage the brain. Lawsuits followed. Some inmates argued the conditions violated the Eighth Amendment prohibition against cruel and unusual punishment. Others claimed the lack of meaningful human contact constituted inhumane treatment. The federal government responded with one consistent defense: these inmates left us no alternative. According to officials, ADX Florence was not about punishment. It was about protection. Protection of guards. Protection of other inmates. Protection of the public. The question, however, remained unanswered. At what point does security become cruelty? A prison that changed the system. Whether viewed as a necessary safeguard or a moral failure, ADX Florence fundamentally reshaped how the United States deals with its most dangerous criminals. It set a precedent. Isolation could be indefinite. Control could be absolute. And security could override rehabilitation entirely. Other countries took notice. Other prison systems studied its design. And debates about solitary confinement intensified worldwide. But ADX Florence remains unique. Because no other prison in America, and few anywhere else, operate at this level of isolation. And as the years passed, one truth became impossible to ignore. ADX Florence was not just holding inmates. It was testing the limits of what the human mind can endure. To understand what makes ADX Florence so feared, you have to move beyond statistics and security labels. You have to experience a single day. Because inside this prison, time itself becomes a weapon. There are no bells signaling movement. No loud announcements echoing through corridors. No crowds, no noise, no chaos. Instead, there is silence. Deep, engineered silence. Broken only by the mechanical hum of electronic doors and the distant footsteps of guards moving through reinforced hallways. For inmates at ADX Florence, every day begins exactly the same. And that sameness is intentional. 5 a.m., waking up alone. There is no alarm clock. Inmates wake up because their bodies tell them to, or because they never truly slept at all. The cell lights are controlled remotely. When they turn on, they flood the cell with harsh, artificial brightness. There is no gradual sunrise. No softness. Just light. Each cell measures roughly 7 by 12 feet. Inside it, everything is fixed in place. A concrete bed slab, molded into the wall. A thin mattress. A concrete desk. A concrete stool. A stainless steel sink and toilet combined into one unit. Nothing can be moved. Nothing can be broken easily. Nothing can be used as a weapon. The walls are thick, soundproof concrete. Inmates cannot hear each other. They cannot shout to neighboring cells. They cannot communicate through pipes or vents. Many inmates describe the silence as unnatural, as if the building itself absorbs sound. Some say it feels like being buried alive. The window that shows nothing. Each cell has a window, but it is not a window in the way most people understand one. It is a narrow slit of reinforced glass, positioned high on the wall and angled toward the sky. From inside the cell, inmates cannot see the surrounding mountains of Colorado. They cannot see roads, fences, or guard towers. They cannot see people. They see only a patch of sky. This design serves a purpose. Without visual reference points, inmates cannot track the passage of seasons or time. Days blur together. Months lose meaning. Former inmates have said that after years inside ADX Florence, they stopped knowing what month it was, sometimes even what year. Breakfast, without a word. Meals arrive through a narrow slot in the steel door. There is no human interaction, no greeting, no conversation, no eye contact. The tray slides in. The slot closes. Breakfast is eaten alone, sitting on a concrete stool, in silence. Even utensils are carefully selected to prevent self-harm or weaponization. Food is not the punishment here. Isolation is. 23 hours a day, inside the cell. The defining feature of life at ADX Florence is not what happens, it's what doesn't. There are no group activities, no shared meals, no classrooms, no jobs. Inmates remain inside their cells for 23 hours every day. They read, they pace, they think, or they try not to think at all. For many, the mind becomes the greatest threat. Psychologists have documented that prolonged isolation can cause severe anxiety, depression, panic attacks, memory loss, paranoia, hallucinations. Inmates have reported hearing voices, seeing movement where none exists, and losing the ability to concentrate for more than a few minutes. Some begin talking to themselves, not out of madness, but out of desperation to hear a human voice. The recreation hour. Once per day, inmates are allowed out of their cells, alone. This is often referred to as recreation, but the term is misleading. The recreation area is a small, empty concrete enclosure, sometimes open to the sky, sometimes partially covered. Inmates are escorted there in full restraints. Handcuffs, leg irons, waist chains. They are searched before and after. They do not see other inmates. There are no weights, no sports, no social interaction. Some inmates choose not to leave their cells at all, because even this brief movement can feel overwhelming after years of confinement. Medical and mental health care. Medical visits are conducted through thick glass barriers whenever possible. Mental health evaluations are brief and controlled. Critics argue that meaningful therapy is impossible under these conditions, that you cannot treat psychological damage while actively causing it. The federal government counters that inmates at ADX Florence receive constitutionally adequate care. The debate remains unresolved. What is known as this? Mental illness is common inside the facility and often worsens over time. Some inmates who entered ADX Florence without serious mental health issues developed them after years in isolation. Others deteriorated rapidly. Communication with the outside world. Contact with family is limited and heavily monitored. Visits, when allowed, take place behind thick glass. There is no physical contact. No handshakes. No hugs. Phone calls are restricted. Letters are screened. Even communication with lawyers is tightly controlled. For inmates serving life sentences, family contact may be the only reminder that a world still exists beyond concrete walls. And for some, even that connection fades. The role of the guards. Correctional officers at ADX Florence are trained differently from those in other prisons. They are taught to minimize interaction, to maintain emotional distance, to follow strict routines. This is not about cruelty, it is about control. Yet many guards have acknowledged that the environment takes a toll on them as well. The silence, the tension, the awareness that every inmate housed here has been deemed extremely dangerous. Some officers describe a constant low-level anxiety. Others report emotional numbness. Working at ADX Florence is not just a job. It is psychological exposure. Punishment without end. For most inmates, there is no clear path out. While the Bureau of Prisons maintains that inmates can earn transfers to lower security facilities through good behavior, former inmates and advocates argue that such transfers are rare and often subjective. For many prisoners, ADX Florence becomes permanent. Years turn into decades. And the punishment is not physical pain. It is endurance. Enduring silence. Enduring sameness. Enduring isolation. One former inmate described it this way. After a while, you stop thinking about getting out. You start thinking about how much longer your mind can last. A system that never blinks. Every movement inside ADX Florence is monitored. Cameras observe corridors, cells, and recreation areas. Schedules are logged. Behavior is documented. Nothing is left to chance. This constant surveillance reinforces the core philosophy of the prison. Control must never fail. But it also reinforces a deeper question. What happens when control becomes the defining feature of punishment? when security outweighs rehabilitation completely, when isolation is not temporary, but endless. In the next chapter, we will examine who is sent to ADX Florence, the inmates whose crimes, influence, or violence convinced the U.S. government that this level of isolation was the only option left. Not every federal prisoner ends up inside ADX Florence. In fact, only a tiny fraction of inmates across the entire United States prison system are ever transferred here. This facility was never designed to house large numbers. It was built to contain outliers, individuals whose behavior, influence, or violence placed them outside the reach of even the harshest maximum security prisons. To be sent to ADX Florence is not just a transfer. It is a declaration by the federal government that an inmate has crossed a line from manageable to uncontainable, the final destination in the federal system. Within the Bureau of Prisons, ADX Florence is considered the end of the road. Most inmates begin their sentences in lower security facilities. As behavior worsens or risks increase, they are moved upward from low security to medium, from medium to high, and finally to maximum security. ADX Florence sits above all of them. Inmates are typically sent here after demonstrating one or more of the following: extreme violence toward guards, murder or attempted murder of other inmates, leadership roles in powerful criminal organizations, continued criminal activity from inside prison, escape attempts or successful prison breaks, terrorism or national security threats. This is not a prison for impulsive violence alone. It is a prison for persistent threat, when control fails elsewhere. Many inmates arrive at ADX Florence only after every other option has failed. They may have been placed in segregation units repeatedly. They may have been isolated temporarily. They may have been transferred from prison to prison. And still, the violence continued. Some inmates were able to command loyalty and fear even from inside solitary units. Others used coded messages, legal visits, or corrupted staff to maintain influence. In traditional prisons, power spreads through proximity. ADX Florence eliminates proximity altogether. That is why the inmates sent here are often described as leaders without followers, men whose authority collapses once isolation removes their audience. Terrorism and national security cases. One of the most controversial groups housed at ADX Florence includes inmates convicted of terrorism-related offenses. These prisoners are not just seen as criminals. They are viewed as ongoing ideological threats. The concern is not simply violence. It is communication. Federal authorities fear that even limited contact could allow radicalization, coordination, or symbolic influence to spread beyond prison walls. Isolation becomes a containment strategy, not just of the body, but of ideas. Critics argue this blurs the line between incarceration and ideological suppression. Supporters argue the risks are too high to allow anything else. Organized crime and gang leaders. ADX Florence has also housed leaders of powerful criminal organizations, individuals capable of issuing orders that reach far beyond prison walls. In these cases, the prison is not reacting to what an inmate has done recently. It is reacting to what that inmate could still do. Organized crime thrives on communication, loyalty, and structure. ADX Florence strips all three away. No meetings, no whispers, no hierarchy, just isolation. From the government's perspective, this makes ADX Florence uniquely effective. From the inmate's perspective, it is total erasure. Serial violence and predatory behavior. Some inmates are sent to ADX Florence not because of influence, but because of relentless violence. These are prisoners who assault repeatedly, who show no response to punishment, who treat confinement as an opportunity rather than a deterrent. In traditional prisons, these inmates pose constant risks to others. At ADX Florence, there are no others to harm. Isolation becomes the only barrier left. But critics argue this approach does not address the underlying causes of violence. It merely removes the targets. Escape artists and system exploiters. Another category includes inmates who have attempted or successfully carried out escapes. Escapes represent a failure of control, something the federal prison system cannot tolerate. ADX Florence was designed specifically to eliminate that risk. The architecture, surveillance, and procedures are meant to ensure that escape is not merely difficult, but inconceivable. For inmates with a history of exploiting systems, routines, or human error, This prison represents a locked door with no cracks. How the decision is made. Transfers to ADX Florence are not automatic. They involve internal reviews, security assessments, and classification decisions made by federal prison officials. Inmates are evaluated based on disciplinary history, threat assessments, intelligence reports, psychological evaluations, influence within prison populations. However, critics argue the process lacks transparency. Inmates often claim they are not given clear explanations for why they were transferred or what they must do to leave. This lack of clarity fuels one of the central controversies surrounding ADX Florence. Is isolation being used as management or as punishment without end? Life sentences inside a life sentence. Many inmates at ADX Florence are already serving multiple life sentences. For them, transfer to the facility does not change the length of their incarceration. It changes the conditions. Instead of decades surrounded by other prisoners, routines, and limited social structures, they face decades alone. This creates a unique psychological burden. Hope, already fragile, becomes almost abstract. For inmates with no release date, ADX Florence can feel less like imprisonment and more like permanent disappearance. The possibility of leaving. Officially, ADX Florence is not always permanent. The Bureau of Prisons maintains that inmates can earn transfers to lower security facilities through sustained good behavior. In practice, such transfers are rare. Former inmates and advocates argue that once an inmate is labeled ADX material, the label follows them indefinitely. Good behavior in isolation is difficult to define. When there are no interactions, no opportunities for conflict, and no meaningful activities, what does rehabilitation even look like? This ambiguity keeps many inmates in a state of uncertainty, unsure whether compliance leads anywhere at all. The human question. Behind every classification decision is a human being. Dangerous, yes, but still human. This reality lies at the heart of the ADX Florence debate. Supporters argue the prison saves lives. Critics argue it destroys minds. The inmates sent here are undeniably among the most dangerous in the system. But the question remains. Does removing a person from society justify removing them from meaningful human contact entirely? And if so, for how long? In the next chapter, we will examine the psychological effects of long-term isolation, what science, testimony, and internal reports reveal about what happens to the human mind when silence and solitude become permanent. When officials defend ADX Florence, they usually point to one fact above all others. There has never been an escape. From a security perspective, the prison works exactly as designed. But security statistics do not measure the cost paid inside the human mind. And it is here, in the unseen psychological consequences of long-term isolation, that ADX Florence becomes most controversial. Because while concrete can contain a body, the mind responds very differently. Isolation as a psychological force. Human beings are social by nature. Our brains are wired for interaction, for conversation, facial expressions, shared space, and sensory feedback from others. When those elements are removed, the brain does not simply rest. It reacts. Psychologists describe prolonged solitary confinement as a form of sensory and social deprivation, and its effects are well documented across decades of research. The problem is not boredom. The problem is disorientation. Without regular interaction, the brain begins to lose its normal reference points for reality. Time slows down. Thoughts loop. Emotions flatten or explode without warning. And in ADX Florence, this is not temporary. It is routine. The first stage, anxiety and hyperawareness. In the early months of isolation, many inmates report heightened anxiety. Every sound becomes amplified. Every movement feels significant. The mind searches constantly for stimulation. Guards walking past the cell. The mechanical click of a door. The distant echo of footsteps. Inmates may pace for hours, unable to sit still. Sleep becomes irregular. Some describe feeling watched even when alone, a response to constant surveillance and lack of privacy. At this stage, inmates are often still mentally sharp. They count days. They mark routines. They tell themselves this is temporary. But as weeks turn into months, something changes. The collapse of time. Without social markers, days begin to blend together. There are no conversations to separate one moment from another. No events to remember. No changes in routine. Psychologists call this temporal disintegration. Inmates begin to lose track of dates, seasons, length of confinement. Some stop knowing how long they've been in the facility. Others report feeling as if time has stopped entirely, that they are suspended in a permanent present. This loss of temporal awareness is deeply destabilizing, because when the future becomes abstract, hope becomes fragile. Cognitive decline. One of the most alarming effects of long-term isolation is cognitive deterioration. Former inmates and mental health experts have reported difficulty concentrating, memory lapses, reduced problem-solving ability, trouble forming coherent thoughts. Tasks that once felt simple, reading, writing, focusing, become exhausting. Some inmates can no longer read books for more than a few minutes. Others abandon intellectual activity altogether because it reminds them of what they've lost. This decline is not caused by injury. It is caused by underuse. The brain, deprived of stimulation, begins to shut down non-essential functions. Hallucinations and distorted reality. As isolation deepens, some inmates experience hallucinations. Not dramatic visions, but subtle distortions. Shadows that move. Sounds that aren't there. Voices that feel external but originate internally. These experiences are not signs of insanity in the traditional sense. They are signs of a brain trying to create input where none exists. In some cases, inmates are aware the hallucinations are not real. In others, the line between imagination and reality begins to blur. This is where isolation becomes dangerous. Because once reality feels unstable, fear intensifies. Depression and emotional flattening. Long-term isolation often leads to severe depression, but it does not always look the way people expect. Some inmates become visibly hopeless, withdrawn, tearful, despondent. Others experience emotional numbness. They stop feeling anger. They stop feeling sadness. They stop feeling joy. This emotional shutdown is a defense mechanism. When nothing changes and nothing improves, the mind adapts by feeling less. The danger is that emotional numbness often precedes suicidal thoughts, self-harm, and suicidal ideation. ADX Florence has faced repeated criticism over high rates of self-harm among inmates. Isolation increases the risk of self-injury, suicidal ideation, suicide attempts. For some inmates, pain becomes a way to feel something, anything, in an environment defined by sensory deprivation. For others, death begins to feel like the only form of escape left. Correctional staff are trained to monitor warning signs, but critics argue monitoring alone cannot compensate for conditions that actively contribute to psychological collapse. The paradox of safety. From an institutional perspective, ADX Florence is safe. Violence between inmates is nearly non-existent. Attacks on staff are rare. Order is absolute. But mental health experts point out a paradox. A prison can be physically safe while being psychologically destructive. In ADX Florence, safety is achieved by removing interaction entirely. The question is whether that trade-off is justified. Can the damage be reversed? One of the most troubling questions surrounding long-term isolation is whether its effects are permanent. Some former inmates transferred out of ADX Florence report gradual improvement. Others say the damage never fully fades. Common long-term effects include social withdrawal, difficulty trusting others, persistent anxiety, inability to tolerate noise or crowds. In some cases, inmates released directly from isolation into society struggle to function. They have learned how to survive alone, not how to live among others. The ethical debate. Supporters of ADX Florence argue that the inmates housed there are exceptional cases. They point out that these individuals posed extreme risks that isolation successfully neutralized. Critics counter that mental destruction should never be an acceptable tool of control. They argue that punishment should not erase a person's ability to think, feel, or connect. International human rights organizations have repeatedly criticized prolonged solitary confinement, calling it a form of psychological torture when used long-term. The United States government rejects that characterization. The debate continues. Unresolved, emotionally charged, and deeply political. A silent experiment. Whether acknowledged or not, ADX Florence represents a long-running experiment. An experiment in control. An experiment in isolation. An experiment testing how far a system can go to maintain order. The results are visible. not in escape statistics, but in human minds shaped by silence. And as the prison continues to operate, one question refuses to go away. At what point does absolute security come at too high a human cost? In the next chapter, we will examine the guards, the lawsuits, and the public backlash, and how ADX Florence became one of the most controversial prisons in the world. From the outside, ADX Florence appears immovable, a fortress of concrete and steel designed to operate beyond emotion, controversy, or doubt. Inside, however, the reality is far more complicated. Because while inmates live in near total isolation, they are not the only people affected by the environment. The guards who work here, the lawyers who challenge its legality, and the critics who question its morality all exist within the gravity of this prison. And over time, ADX Florence has become more than a facility. It has become a legal and ethical battleground. The men and women who work inside, correctional officers at ADX Florence, are often described as the most highly trained in the federal prison system. They are selected carefully, screened psychologically, trained extensively in procedure, restraint, and crisis response. This is not a place for improvisation. Every movement is scripted. Every interaction is controlled. Every deviation is documented. Officers work behind reinforced barriers, monitoring inmates through cameras, slots, and remote systems. In many cases, they do not see inmates face-to-face for weeks. The job is not physically violent, but it is mentally demanding. The silent pressure on staff. Former guards have described the environment as unnerving, not because of chaos, but because of the absence of it. No noise, no shouting, no crowds, just long corridors, heavy doors, and the knowledge that behind each one is an inmate deemed too dangerous for any other prison. Some guards report heightened stress and emotional fatigue. Others describe a gradual emotional detachment, a necessary adaptation to working in a place where human interaction is intentionally minimized. You cannot build relationships here. You cannot rely on rapport. You cannot soften. Professional distance is survival. When the system affects its enforcers, over time, the environment takes its toll. Guards have reported anxiety, sleep disturbances, emotional numbness, burnout. The same silence that defines inmate life also defines the workspace. Some officers request transfers after short periods. Others stay for years, not because it is easy, but because it is controlled, predictable, and structured. In a strange way, ADX Florence creates its own psychological ecosystem, one that affects everyone inside its walls. Lawsuits from the inside. Almost from its opening, ADX Florence has faced legal challenges. Inmates have filed lawsuits alleging cruel and unusual punishment, psychological harm from prolonged isolation, inadequate mental health care, lack of meaningful review or exit pathways. At the heart of these cases is the Eighth Amendment, which prohibits cruel and unusual punishment. The argument is not that inmates are being physically abused. It is that mental suffering, when prolonged and extreme, can be just as damaging. The government's defense. Federal authorities have consistently defended ADX Florence using three core arguments. Necessity. The inmates housed there represent extreme risks that cannot be managed elsewhere. Security. The prison has successfully prevented escapes, violence, and organized criminal activity. Legality. Courts have generally ruled that the conditions, while harsh, do not violate constitutional standards when applied to exceptional cases. In many instances, judges have sided with the government, emphasizing deference to prison administrators on matters of security. But those rulings have not ended the debate. They have intensified it. The cases that changed the narrative. Some lawsuits have forced changes. In particular, cases involving inmates with severe mental illness brought increased scrutiny. Courts began questioning whether placing mentally ill inmates in long-term isolation constituted punishment for illness rather than behavior. As a result, the Bureau of Prisons implemented limited reforms, improved mental health evaluations, greater documentation requirements, more structured review processes. Critics argue these changes are insufficient. Supporters argue they demonstrate oversight and adaptation. The truth likely lies somewhere in between. International criticism. Outside the United States, ADX Florence has drawn condemnation from international human rights organizations. Prolonged solitary confinement has been labeled by some experts as a form of psychological torture when used for extended periods. The United Nations has recommended strict limits on isolation duration. The United States has rejected the characterization that ADX Florence violates international norms, arguing that the prison houses exceptional cases. Isolation is reviewed periodically. Security concerns outweigh external standards. This clash highlights a deeper divide. Security versus human rights. Control versus dignity. Public backlash and media exposure. For years, ADX Florence operated largely out of public view. That changed as investigative journalists, documentaries, and former inmates began speaking publicly. Stories emerged describing hallucinations, emotional breakdowns, suicide attempts, lifelong psychological damage. These accounts shifted public perception. The prison was no longer just a security solution. It became a symbol, to some, of necessary strength, to others, of institutional cruelty. The question of transparency. One of the strongest criticisms of ADX Florence is secrecy. The facility is closed to most media. Access is limited. Information is controlled. This lack of transparency fuels suspicion. If the prison's practices are justified, critics ask, why not allow greater oversight? Supporters respond that exposure creates security risks, and that secrecy is part of control. Once again, the system prioritizes containment over perception. Does control justify everything? At its core, the controversy surrounding ADX Florence comes down to a single question. Is absolute control worth the human cost? Supporters argue yes, because the alternative is chaos, violence, and loss of life. Critics argue no, because a system that destroys the mind undermines the values it claims to protect. This is not a theoretical debate. It plays out every day inside reinforced walls. A prison that reflects a nation. ADX Florence is not an anomaly. It is a reflection of how a society responds to its most feared individuals. When fear dominates, control expands. When control expands, compassion contracts. The prison exists because the system decided that some people could not be managed, only isolated. Whether that decision represents strength or failure depends on where one stands. The unanswered question. As ADX Florence continues to operate, it forces a question that has no easy answer. Can a society committed to justice justify a prison designed to remove human connection entirely? And if so, how far is too far? In the final chapter, we will examine what ADX Florence ultimately reveals about power, punishment, and secrecy in the modern world, and what its existence says about us. When people talk about ADX Florence, they often focus on one fact above all others. No one has ever escaped. And that statistic is true. But if escape is the only measure of success, then we miss the deeper meaning of what this prison represents. Because ADX Florence is not just a facility. It is not just a Supermax prison. It is not just a response to violent crime. It is a statement. A statement about how far a system is willing to go when it decides that control must never fail. Inside these walls, the United States has created an environment where absolute order is achieved by removing nearly everything that makes a human life recognizable. Conversation, touch, shared space, unpredictability, and time itself. Here, danger is not managed. It is erased through isolation. And that raises a question that cannot be locked behind concrete doors. What does it cost to build a system where control is perfect? ADX Florence exists because fear exists. Fear of violence. Fear of influence. Fear of losing control. The men held inside are not random inmates. They are individuals the system judged too dangerous, too disruptive, or too powerful to be managed any other way. In that sense, ADX Florence works. There are no riots. There are no gangs operating openly. There are no escapes. But control achieved through silence comes with consequences that are harder to measure. Psychological damage does not show up in security reports. Hallucinations are not logged as incidents. Loss of identity cannot be quantified. And yet, those consequences are real. They live inside minds shaped by years of isolation. The guards who walk these corridors carry that weight too. They operate in a space where human interaction is minimized by design, where professionalism requires emotional distance, where silence is routine. This is not cruelty, but it is not neutrality either. It is exposure. to an environment where control replaces connection. The lawsuits, the backlash, the criticism, all point to the same unresolved tension. Security versus humanity. Supporters argue that the inmates here forced the system's hand. Critics argue that no crime justifies mental destruction. Both sides claim necessity. Both sides claim protection. And neither side has a simple answer. Because ADX Florence was not built to ask moral questions. It was built to solve a problem. But the existence of this prison forces a larger reflection. Not just about inmates. Not just about punishment. But about power. Who decides when someone is beyond rehabilitation? Who decides how much suffering is acceptable? And who is watching the watchers? ADX Florence operates largely out of sight, a reminder that the most extreme forms of control often exist far from public view. In the end, ADX Florence reveals something uncomfortable, that when fear becomes absolute, control becomes absolute too. And once a system proves it can isolate a human being indefinitely, the real question is no longer whether it works, but whether we are willing to accept what it turns us into. This documentary was not about defending criminals. It was not about condemning guards. It was about understanding a system pushed to its extreme. Because how a society treats the people it fears most says more about that society than any law ever could. Thanks for watching. Like, share, and subscribe.